The night air along Virginia's Colonial Parkway carried a chill that seemed sharper than usual in early October 1986. A thin fog hovered over the York River, drifting lazily across the still water as if trying to conceal the secrets that lay beneath. The scenic road, a 23-mile stretch connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, was normally a refuge for locals, a place where students and young couples came to talk, listen to the river, or escape the noise of the world. But that night it was quiet. Too quiet. The only sounds were the distant rhythm of crickets and the soft rush of wind through the marsh grass. It was the kind of silence that made even the faint hum of a distant engine feel intrusive. A silence so deep it could swallow sound. By morning, that same stillness would be broken, not by nature, but by something far more human. Because what investigators would uncover along that stretch of road would mark the beginning of one of the most haunting unsolved murder series in Virginia's history. A mystery that would come to be known simply as the Colonial Parkway Murders. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. It began with a young couple, 27-year-old Cathy Thomas and 21-year-old Rebecca Dowski. Cathy was confident, accomplished, and fiercely independent. A 1981 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, she had broken barriers in a male-dominated environment and had gone on to work for a private security firm in Virginia. Those who knew her described her as driven but deeply kind, a natural leader who commanded respect with quiet strength. Friends said she had a dry wit, loved animals, and never backed away from a challenge. Rebecca, a senior at the College of William and Mary, was a contrast in energy, bright, warm, artistic, and endlessly optimistic. She was an English major with a passion for poetry and literature, someone who saw beauty in small things and spoke of becoming a teacher someday. The two women had met through mutual friends the previous spring. What began as a friendship quickly deepened into something more. They were private about their relationship, not because of shame, but because of the times. In 1986, being an openly gay couple in a conservative region carried risks. Even within their circles, they kept things discreet. Yet, despite the quietness of their love, those close to them said it was genuine and full of peace. That October evening, they decided to spend time together away from campus and the bustle of Williamsburg. Cathy drove her white Honda Civic, and the two set out toward the Colonial Parkway, one of their favorite places to unwind. The parkway was beautiful that time of year, the leaves along the riverbank just beginning to turn gold and red, the scent of pine and saltwater mixing in the air. Somewhere between Williamsburg and Yorktown, they pulled over near the Cheatham Annex Overlook, a secluded area with a view of the York River. It was the kind of spot people often stopped at, peaceful, scenic, and unthreatening. Cathy's Honda was seen leaving Williamsburg late that night. It would be the last time anyone ever saw them alive. The next morning, a jogger running near the overlook noticed something odd at the edge of the riverbank. A small white car appeared to be partially submerged in the water, its rear end barely visible through the fog. At first, it looked like an accident. Maybe someone had misjudged the curve. But as the jogger got closer, unease took hold. The car's windows were rolled up, the doors closed, and there was no sign of movement inside. When police arrived, the peaceful morning turned heavy. Officers waded into the cold, shallow water toward the vehicle. What they found inside would haunt them for decades. Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were both in the car. The vehicle was upside down, the ignition off, the doors locked. Both victims had been brutally killed, their throats slashed with precision, and rope marks on their wrists and necks suggested they had been restrained. There were traces of adhesive residue consistent with tape, and both women were fully clothed. Their personal belongings remained untouched. Cathy's purse, Rebecca's school papers, and even the car keys. There was no evidence of robbery, no sexual assault, and no clear motive. Whoever had done this had acted with calm, deliberate control, and had left almost nothing behind. The Colonial Parkway is federal land, maintained by the National Park Service, which meant the case immediately fell under the jurisdiction of the FBI. The Virginia State Police and Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, joined the investigation, forming a multi-agency task force. The involvement of federal authorities gave the case gravity. It was rare for such a gruesome double murder to occur on a federal parkway, and rarer still for it to appear so calculated. At the crime scene, investigators worked methodically. Tire impressions near the overlook suggested another vehicle had been parked nearby. The Honda's gear was in park, and the interior showed signs of a struggle. A faint smudge of blood on the door panel. A few strands of hair caught on the seatbelt latch. Yet, crucially, there were no fingerprints, no weapon, no clear trace of the killer's presence. The rope fibers and faint tape residue were sent to the FBI lab for analysis, but the technology of the mid-1980s offered limited forensic potential. One thing stood out immediately: the precision. Whoever committed the murders seemed to know exactly what they were doing. There was no panic, no randomness. The wounds were clean, and the disposal of the car, pushed into the water to simulate an accident, suggested a killer with both intelligence and nerve. One early theory began circulating among investigators. Could the killer have impersonated a police officer? That idea gained traction after several locals reported being stopped along the Colonial Parkway by unmarked vehicles flashing blue or red lights on the dashboard. The officer would issue verbal warnings but never write tickets. When those drivers later called local departments to verify the encounters, they were told no such stops had been recorded. Had Cathy and Rebecca pulled over that night, believing they were complying with law enforcement? Or worse, had someone with real authority used their position to disarm them? The possibility terrified investigators. Within days, the story dominated headlines. The Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Daily Press, and the Virginia Gazette ran front-page coverage. Reporters camped outside the Williamsburg police station, hoping for updates. The FBI held daily briefings but released little, emphasizing that speculation could compromise the case. Cathy's family flew in from Massachusetts. Her father, Jack Thomas, a retired Navy officer, was devastated but determined. He pressed for answers, writing letters to state and federal agencies, demanding that the case remain active. Cathy's brother Billy, also in the Navy, traveled to Virginia to assist investigators. Standing at the riverbank during one of the searches, he reportedly said, "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Rebecca's family was equally shattered. Her mother, Phyllis Dowski, described her daughter as the kind of person who couldn't say no when someone needed help. Rebecca's classmates at William and Mary held vigils on campus. Students reading poetry, singing hymns, and placing candles at the base of a memorial tree. For many, it was the first time the brutality of violent crime had touched their close-knit community. Investigators pursued multiple theories. Some wondered if the killings were a hate crime, given the women's relationship and the era's social tensions. Others suspected a robbery or random act of violence, but nothing fit. No valuables were missing, and the crime scene showed a level of control rarely seen in opportunistic crimes. Weeks passed. Agents interviewed hundreds of people: Navy personnel from nearby installations, students from local colleges, and residents who used the parkway. Helicopters scanned the wooded areas. Divers combed the riverbed for weapons. Yet every lead withered. DNA testing existed but was primitive, and there was no national database to compare samples. Without fingerprints or eyewitnesses, the investigation ground to a halt. By early 1987, the case had gone cold. Families continued to plead for answers, but headlines began to fade. The Colonial Parkway returned to its quiet routine, though for those who had seen what happened there, that calm would never feel the same again. And then, nearly a year later, that uneasy peace shattered. On September 23, 1987, another pair of young people, 20-year-old David Nobling and 14-year-old Robin Edwards, disappeared after parking near the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area along the James River, about an hour south of the Colonial Parkway. Their truck was found 2 days later, doors open, keys in the ignition. When their bodies were discovered along the shoreline, both had been shot. The parallels were chilling. 2 victims, a remote lover's lane setting, no robbery, no sexual assault. It was then that investigators began to realize Cathy and Rebecca's case might not have been an isolated act of violence, but the beginning of something much darker. From that moment forward, Virginia would live under the shadow of the Colonial Parkway Murders, a string of killings that spanned from 1986 to 1989, claiming at least 8 lives. All young couples, all found near water, all killed with precision. And yet, even now, almost 4 decades later, no one knows who was behind them. How does someone manage to kill again and again along one of the most patrolled scenic routes in the country without ever being seen, heard, or caught? That question would become the obsession of detectives, journalists, and families for the next 3 decades. If you were an investigator, what detail from that first crime scene would you have focused on first? The morning after Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's bodies were discovered, the Colonial Parkway transformed from a tranquil scenic drive into the epicenter of one of the most intense investigations Virginia had ever seen. Federal agents, state troopers, and forensic specialists swarmed the site. Photographers documented every inch of the mud around the Honda Civic, every footprint, every piece of debris that could possibly lead to a clue. But beneath the methodical work, there was a shared unease. Veteran investigators could feel it. This wasn't just a random act of violence. The precision, the calmness, the quiet of the scene. It all spoke of someone who knew how to kill. The Colonial Parkway had no streetlights, no traffic cameras, and few visitors after dark. It was isolated, beautiful, and silent, the perfect hunting ground. FBI Special Agent Larry McCann, who had worked multiple homicides across Virginia, joined the case early on. It wasn't rage, he later said in interviews, it was controlled. Whoever did this took their time. As agents reconstructed the timeline, they learned that Cathy and Rebecca had last been seen leaving a friend's house in Williamsburg around 9:30 p.m. They planned to drive along the parkway, maybe talk for a while before heading home. Sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., the killer struck. Investigators mapped the location of the Honda and studied the terrain. The overlook was barely visible from the road. To reach the spot where the car was found, one had to drive onto a narrow dirt pull-off that dipped toward the river. Anyone parked there would have been hidden from passing vehicles, and anyone approaching them could have done so unseen. That fact haunted detectives. The theory that the killer may have impersonated law enforcement gained traction almost immediately. In the 1980s, it wasn't uncommon for unmarked cars to have dash lights, and most people didn't question them. A single flashing light in the dark would have been enough to make a driver pull over. The FBI sent out a public advisory warning citizens not to stop for unmarked cars unless they could verify the officer's identity. Patrol divisions across southeastern Virginia began double-checking their traffic stop logs, but no one reported stopping Cathy or Rebecca that night. Meanwhile, the forensic teams worked around the clock. The fibers found on the victim's clothing were consistent with nylon rope, the kind often used in boating or camping. The tape residue indicated the use of duct tape, possibly to bind their mouths. Yet no fingerprints were found on the tape fragments or inside the car. The killer had either worn gloves or wiped everything meticulously clean. Agents searched nearby marinas, hardware stores, and military supply shops. The proximity of the Naval Weapons Station and other installations led investigators to consider whether the killer could have had a military background. Someone familiar with knots, with discipline, and with procedure. Still, for all their effort, they were chasing shadows. In the weeks that followed, the case took on a strange rhythm. Bursts of activity when a lead appeared, then long stretches of silence when it dissolved. Anonymous tips flooded hotlines. One caller claimed to have seen a dark-colored van parked near the overlook around 10:30 p.m. Another insisted they'd spotted a uniformed officer's vehicle in the same area, but nothing could be verified. As fall turned to winter, the investigation slowed. FBI field offices in Richmond and Norfolk continued to coordinate, but without DNA, surveillance footage, or eyewitnesses, progress was agonizingly slow. Then, just as the case was losing public momentum, another murder reignited the fear. On September 23, 1987, nearly a year after Cathy and Rebecca were killed, a young couple disappeared from Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area in Isle of Wight County, about 30 miles from the Colonial Parkway. 20-year-old David Nobling, a construction worker known for his sense of humor and quiet maturity, had picked up 14-year-old Robin Edwards, a spirited teenager from nearby Hampton. The two had known each other through family friends, and though the age difference was noticeable, those close to them said David often looked out for her, more of a protective older figure than a boyfriend. That night, they parked near the river to talk. It was drizzling lightly, the moon veiled by low clouds. Sometime after midnight, David's father noticed his son hadn't returned home. By morning, his truck was found abandoned at the edge of the parking lot. Doors open, keys in the ignition, radio still on. 2 days later, a search party found their bodies along the muddy banks of the James River. Both had been shot in the head. David's wallet was missing, but Robin's purse remained untouched. No signs of sexual assault, no robbery, just execution. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A couple attacked near water, personal items left behind, and a killer who left no trace. When news of the second double homicide broke, the FBI immediately reopened Cathy and Rebecca's files. McCann and other agents began searching for parallels. The media, too, noticed. Headlines started using the term Parkway Killer. Within months, the third pair of victims would be discovered. In April 1988, 24-year-old Cassandra Sandy Haley and 20-year-old Richard Keith Call attended a party near Christopher Newport University in Newport News. The couple had started dating only recently. Both were friendly, grounded, and well-liked. That night, they left the gathering around 1:30 a.m., telling friends they planned to take a drive before heading home. Keith's red Toyota Celica was spotted later that night heading toward the Colonial Parkway. By dawn, neither had returned. When their parents reported them missing, police initially suspected the couple might have run away together. But that theory collapsed 2 days later when Keith's car was found abandoned along the parkway, doors unlocked, keys on the dashboard, and Sandy's shoes neatly placed on the floorboard. Their bodies were never found. For investigators, it was the cruelest echo yet. Another young couple, another riverside disappearance, another car left behind in eerie orderliness. This time, however, the killer had left not even a body to study, just absence. Inside the FBI's Norfolk field office, the case files began to stack up. Cathy and Rebecca, David and Robin, Sandy and Keith. 3 pairs in less than 2 years. The task force grew desperate for patterns. They built maps connecting each location, Colonial Parkway, Ragged Island, the York River, all within an hour's drive of one another, all near secluded parking areas popular among couples. They compiled psychological profiles, consulted behavioral analysts, even reached out to the newly formed FBI Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico. What emerged was chilling. The killer was likely a local male, familiar with the region's waterways and patrol schedules. He may have posed as a law enforcement officer, using authority to lower victims' guard. He selected couples deliberately, not impulsively, and struck when they were most vulnerable. Isolated, distracted, unaware. The working theory was that he enjoyed control more than violence itself. Each attack was precise, as if following a pattern that only he understood. By late 1988, public fear had turned into paranoia. Couples stopped visiting the parkway after dark. Signs were posted urging caution. The FBI conducted dozens of stakeouts using decoy vehicles to mimic parked cars. Agents waited for weeks, but the killer never reappeared. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the murders seemed to stop. But the quiet wouldn't last. In the fall of 1989, the cycle returned. 18-year-old Anna Maria Phelps and 19-year-old Daniel Lauer disappeared while driving from Virginia Beach to Amelia County. Daniel's car was found abandoned along Interstate 64 near a rest stop outside Williamsburg, just miles from the Colonial Parkway. Inside were their personal belongings, untouched. 6 weeks later, deer hunters stumbled upon 2 skeletal remains in the woods nearby. Both victims had been murdered. The realization hit investigators like a wave. Whoever was killing along Virginia's scenic routes wasn't gone, just waiting. Over the next several years, detectives struggled to connect the dots. Some believed the same killer was responsible for all 4 double homicides. Others suspected multiple offenders, or even an organized group. The FBI's behavioral profile leaned toward a single perpetrator, methodical, intelligent, and capable of disappearing into normal life between killings. Families demanded answers. Jack Thomas, Cathy's father, refused to let the case fade. He met with journalists, filed Freedom of Information requests, and challenged the FBI publicly. "My daughter was a Naval Academy graduate," he said during a 1989 interview. "She served her country. All we ask is that her country serve her now." His persistence kept the case alive in the press, but leads remained scarce. By the early 1990s, advances in DNA testing reignited hope. Evidence from the original crime scenes was resubmitted for analysis. Partial profiles were recovered, but they didn't match any entries in national databases. The technology, though improving, wasn't yet powerful enough to draw definitive conclusions. Years passed. Agents retired, families aged. The files grew thicker but no closer to resolution. And then, decades later, the world changed, and so did forensics. By 2009, DNA technology had advanced to the point where even trace evidence could yield results. The FBI reopened several of the Colonial Parkway cases for re-examination, comparing samples against expanding databases. Retired agents returned to consult. New investigators brought fresh energy, combing through old photographs, old tapes, and even revisiting the original crime scenes. They found things that earlier generations of investigators couldn't. Tiny details that had been invisible in 1986 but spoke volumes under modern scrutiny. A strand of hair. A faint fingerprint fragment. A tire pattern preserved in photographs. And yet, despite new technology, the killer's identity remained elusive. Nearly 40 years after Cathy and Rebecca's deaths, the Colonial Parkway remains one of America's most haunting, unsolved serial murder cases. A chilling reminder that even the most idyllic places can conceal unimaginable darkness. But in Virginia, those who remember still ask the same question whispered along the riverbanks. Who was the phantom of the Colonial Parkway? And will he ever be unmasked? As fall turned to winter in 1987, the once idyllic Colonial Parkway transformed from a quiet scenic drive into a corridor of fear. The Virginia woods that once whispered with wind now seemed to hold their breath. With 2 pairs of victims discovered under eerily similar circumstances, young couples, secluded locations, no robbery, no clear motive. Investigators realized they were confronting something far more sinister than isolated tragedy. The FBI, Virginia State Police, and local law enforcement formed a joint task force. For the first time, they publicly acknowledged a possible connection between the murders of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in 1986 and David Knobling and Robin Edwards in 1987. Though the second crime occurred just across the James River from the Colonial Parkway, at Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, near Newport News, the parallels were impossible to dismiss. Both pairs had last been seen alive after parking near scenic overlooks. Both cases showed no sign of sexual assault, and both lacked clear forensic evidence. It was this precision, this emptiness of motive, that unnerved even veteran investigators. Inside FBI field offices, walls were soon covered with maps, photos, and hand-drawn timelines. The red string connecting the murders crisscrossed the eastern edge of Virginia, forming an invisible thread of fear that stretched from Williamsburg to Hampton. Dozens of agents rotated in and out, each combing through case files, witness lists, and behavioral profiles. Every lead, no matter how small, was logged and cross-referenced. Federal agents began reviewing hundreds of traffic stops along the parkway. They examined reports of drivers being pulled over by unmarked vehicles flashing dashboard lights. Witnesses described the same chilling detail. The officer never wrote a ticket, only gave verbal warnings before sending them on their way. When investigators followed up, they found that none of those stops were documented by the local sheriff's offices or the state police. The theory that had emerged in Cathy and Rebecca's case, that their killer might have impersonated law enforcement, began to gain alarming traction. Was someone using the authority of a badge, real or fake, to lure victims into trust? Nearly a year later, on April 9, 1988, the Colonial Parkway claimed yet another young couple, 18-year-old Cassandra, Sandy Haley, and 20-year-old Keith Call. The pair were last seen leaving a college party near the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. Keith's 1982 Toyota Celica was later discovered abandoned near the York River overlook. Doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. Inside were their personal belongings, Sandy's purse, Keith's wallet, even leftover fast food wrappers. But neither of them was ever seen again. This time, there were no bodies, no crime scene to analyze, just an empty car and a void of evidence. To investigators, it was both a nightmare and a confirmation. 3 couples in less than 2 years, all vanishing or dying within a small geographic area, all sharing the same haunting elements. For the families, the agony was unbearable. Sandy's parents held on to hope long after police began referring to the case in the past tense. They kept their daughter's room exactly as she left it, photos on the dresser, a college acceptance letter pinned to the wall. "We don't have a grave to visit," her mother once said. So this room became our vigil. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the same team that had assisted in major serial investigations nationwide, was brought in to profile the possible offender. Their findings were chillingly clinical. The killer was likely male, familiar with police tactics, methodical, and comfortable operating in remote areas. He may have known the layout of the parkway intimately, possibly from law enforcement, military, or local work. He likely possessed a vehicle capable of transporting victims discreetly and the confidence to control a situation without resistance. That profile reignited fears that the killer could be someone from within, someone who blended seamlessly into the authority structures designed to protect the community. But without hard evidence, the theory remained speculation. By 1989, the Colonial Parkway's reputation had darkened. Locals avoided the area at night. Lovers' lanes, once popular for weekend drives, grew silent. What was once a romantic stretch of history and beauty had become a corridor of dread. Then, on April 9, 1989, almost exactly 1 year after Haley and Call vanished, 2 more young people disappeared. 18-year-old Anna Maria Phelps and 21-year-old Daniel Lauer were traveling from Virginia Beach to Amelia County. They were close friends. Daniel was dating Anna's sister, and were headed west to pick up some of Anna's belongings. They never arrived. Days later, Daniel's Chevrolet Nova was found abandoned at a rest area along Interstate 64 near New Kent County. Their suitcases were inside the car, untouched. It would take 6 more weeks before hunters stumbled upon their remains in a remote, heavily wooded area just off the highway. Both victims showed signs of foul play, though their cause of death could not be precisely determined due to decomposition. Their bodies were found together, positioned side by side, a grim echo of the earlier Colonial Parkway cases. The similarities could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Each case involved pairs, usually young couples, vanishing or dying in or around Virginia's most historic corridor. No robbery, no apparent sexual motive, no clear forensic trail. The pattern was unmistakable, and the fear that one man, one unseen predator, was stalking lovers along the parkway took firm hold. Investigators combed through the possibility of a serial killer, but the FBI refused to declare one officially. Public panic, they feared, would complicate an already fragile investigation. But for those living in the Tidewater region, there was little doubt left. Rumors began spreading. Was the killer a ranger, a military officer, a trucker familiar with the route, or someone posing as police? Theories multiplied as quickly as the unanswered questions. Some residents claimed they'd been followed late at night by cars without headlights until they pulled off the road. Others swore they'd seen suspicious vehicles parked at the overlooks. The FBI sifted through more than 1,500 leads. Forensic experts re-examined evidence from the original 1986 murders, hoping that advances in trace analysis might reveal something new. Rope fibers, tape residues, and hair fragments were preserved and retested, yet time and again, the results came back inconclusive. By the early 1990s, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. Detectives who had once filled briefing rooms with speculation now sat before stacks of silent case files. Public interest faded. Newspapers printed fewer updates. Families of the victims formed bonds through grief and persistence, sharing information, lobbying Congress for continued funding, and pushing to keep the cases in the national spotlight. For them, it was more than a series of unsolved murders. It was an open wound in Virginia's history. The Colonial Parkway itself became a symbol of contradiction, beauty masking horror, history haunted by silence. Even tourists driving through during daylight could sense the tension embedded in the landscape, the way the road curved into dense forest, how the river shimmered deceptively calm. The deeper you went, the more it felt as though the air itself remembered. Investigators never gave up, but without confessions, witnesses, or clear forensic breakthroughs, every theory eventually hit the same wall. And yet, beneath the frustration, hope lingered that one day, a breakthrough in technology, or the conscience of a single person, might finally unravel the mystery. Because by then, the Colonial Parkway murders were no longer just a case. They were a legend whispered along Virginia's coast, a story of fear, loss, and unanswered questions spanning decades. Was the killer a single calculating predator who moved undetected through the heart of history, or were multiple killers responsible, their crimes forever tangled by coincidence and dread? When the last flash of blue light faded from the Colonial Parkway, silence returned. But it was the kind that carried memory, not peace. For decades, that silence lingered, thick with the weight of unanswered questions and unhealed grief. The FBI's initial investigation had been exhaustive. Hundreds of leads, dozens of interviews, stacks of forensic reports, all pointing to nothing that could stand in court. For years, the Colonial Parkway murders became a haunting echo in Virginia's history, mentioned in whispers, referenced in news retrospectives, but never resolved. Then, in 2009, that silence began to crack. That year, the FBI confirmed that several pieces of evidence from multiple Colonial Parkway crime scenes had been submitted for advanced reanalysis using modern forensic technology. These included rope fibers, trace biological materials, and preserved samples that, in the 1980s, were simply beyond the reach of available testing. Advances in DNA profiling, luminol enhancement, and fiber microscopy offered new hope, a chance to pull truth from the dust of time. By 2010, public reports began to circulate that partial DNA profiles had been developed from one or more scenes. The exact details were never released, but for the families and for investigators who had lived with this case for half their careers, it was enough to reignite determination. Still, hope came with caution. For every breakthrough in forensic science, there were roadblocks, contamination, degradation, incomplete matches. The Colonial Parkway's exposure to the elements, especially in the earliest cases, had left evidence fragile. Every sample had to be handled with surgical precision. But even in that uncertainty, something stirred. The families who had carried this pain for over 2 decades began to speak out again, louder than ever. Cathy Thomas's brother, Bill Thomas, became one of the most persistent voices for the victims. He'd spent years pressing the FBI and Virginia State Police for transparency, often driving along the same 23-mile stretch where his sister's life had ended. In interviews, he described how he would sometimes stop near the overlook at Cheatham Annex and just sit, staring at the river, listening to the wind in the trees. "You can feel them there," he once said quietly. "All of them. They never really left." The victims' families came together, forming a small but powerful coalition that refused to let the case fade. They shared notes, memories, and frustrations. They contacted journalists and lobbied for updated coverage. In 2010, renewed national attention arrived when investigative journalists from outlets like CBS News and the Virginian Pilot revisited the case, interviewing surviving relatives and former agents. The FBI, under pressure, reaffirmed its commitment to the investigation. The re-examination wasn't only about technology, it was about patterns. Analysts looked again at the geography of the killings, mapping each location against traffic patterns, naval installations, and shift schedules from the 1980s. The Colonial Parkway, though scenic, had limited access points, and many victims had some link, however small, to the military or nearby institutions. Was that coincidence or a clue? Some investigators quietly speculated that the killer might have had military training, or even active duty access. The controlled nature of the crime scenes, the methodical restraint of the victims, and the lack of panic or struggle all hinted at someone accustomed to command, control, and procedure. But as quickly as theories surfaced, they evaporated again into the fog of uncertainty. By 2011, rumors began to swirl about a potential suspect, a former law enforcement officer with a questionable history of conduct. Though never publicly named, the man's record of traffic stops along the parkway and behavioral complaints drew scrutiny. Yet, when the evidence was compared, it fell short. There was no DNA confirmation, no eyewitness identification, and no confession. It was another dead end. But this one hurt more, because for a brief moment it had seemed so possible. Every false lead brought the same cruel rhythm, hope, then silence. Yet the families refused to retreat. They began organizing annual remembrance events along the Colonial Parkway, gathering near the overlooks where their loved ones had last been seen. They lit candles, read letters, and stood shoulder to shoulder under the same stars that once watched over the victims. For them, remembrance had become resistance. Over time, social media breathed new energy into the investigation. True crime forums, local podcasts, and Facebook groups devoted to cold cases reignited public interest. Bill Thomas himself became a frequent guest on these platforms, urging caution but encouraging awareness. "We're not here to solve it in the court of public opinion," he said, "but we're here to make sure no one forgets." And then came the false hope of confession. In 2014, a man already serving a life sentence in another state claimed involvement in the Colonial Parkway murders. Investigators were skeptical, but any claim connected to the case had to be vetted. For months, agents cross-checked his story, locations, details, timelines, but nothing matched. When confronted with inconsistencies, the man recanted. Every false confession carried the same cruel pattern, a spark of hope, followed by the heavy silence of disappointment. Still, there was progress in small ways. Modernized FBI databases connected evidence across old unsolved homicides in the region, flagging potential overlaps in MO, modus operandi, and victim profile. It wasn't proof, but it hinted that the Colonial Parkway killer might not have stopped, only changed hunting grounds. Meanwhile, the families of the 8 victims continued to meet regularly, maintaining contact with cold case units. They pushed for digital preservation of evidence, fearing degradation with time. Some began advocating for independent review by private forensic labs, though FBI policy prevented the release of certain materials. By 2018, a new wave of optimism swept through the community with the rise of genetic genealogy, a revolutionary tool that had already cracked decades-old cases like the Golden State Killer. Bill Thomas and others lobbied the Bureau to consider it. The FBI's response was measured. The Parkway cases were under review for potential applicability of emerging technology. Even that phrasing, cautious, bureaucratic, and non-committal, was enough to keep hope alive. In many ways, the investigation's reopening symbolized more than a procedural update. It was a resurrection of memory, an acknowledgement that time could not bury truth forever. The road that once held so much horror had become a memorial in motion, its curves lined with invisible stories and names whispered by the wind. But the killer, or killers, who brought that terror to life remained faceless. Somewhere, someone knows what happened on those quiet nights between 1986 and 1989. Someone remembers the sound of an engine shutting off, the glint of headlights on the river, the stillness that followed. And somewhere along those dark bends of the Colonial Parkway, the truth still waits, untouched but not forgotten. The Colonial Parkway Murders. Even the name still tightens throats in towns along Virginia's tidewater. Between 1986 and 1989, a sequence of double homicides and disappearances took place in and around a scenic ribbon of road linking Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. For years, the only consistent element was the pattern itself. Young couples found in or near parked vehicles at secluded overlooks or along quiet riverbanks, personal items left behind, and no obvious motive. That pattern created a kind of dark geometry across southeastern Virginia, a map that investigators and families would return to again and again in search of a single connecting thread. The first crime pulled at the heart of a community. In October 1986, Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were found in Cathy's car near a York River overlook. Their deaths were brutal and precise, evidence of restraint, ligature-like markings, and throat wounds that suggested calm, deliberate action rather than a chaotic, impulsive attack. Their belongings remained in the vehicle: wallets, purses, items that made robbery an unlikely motive. The scene suggested that whoever approached them had not been challenged, that the victims had stopped or stayed where they were with no outward struggle to draw attention. The image of that white Honda, half submerged and still, haunted investigators almost from the moment it was recovered. Then, in September 1987, 2 more young people vanished and were later discovered near the James River. David Knobling and Robin Edwards' truck was found with the doors open and keys in the ignition. When searchers located their bodies along the shoreline, both had been shot. Again, personal items were not taken. Again, the location was a secluded riverside spot where a couple might stop to talk. The differences in method, slashing and ligature in one case, shooting in another, complicated the search for a single signature. Yet the broader circumstances were chillingly similar. In 1988, another car belonging to a young couple was located abandoned in an overlook area. This time, the occupants were never recovered. The absence of bodies in that case left a vacuum where investigators hoped for clues. In 1989, 2 more victims were found months after their disappearance, skeletal remains discovered by hunters in a wooded area not far from an interstate rest stop. Each new case added detail to the map and deepened the mystery, coordinated or coincidental. One killer whose methods evolved, or multiple offenders operating in overlapping territory. The more detectives dug, the more the questions multiplied. Investigative resources were significant. The Colonial Parkway is federal land, and that jurisdictional fact brought the FBI in alongside state police and local agencies. The task force compiled maps, timelines, and witness accounts. They pulled together hundreds of tips. The wall of photos in the Norfolk and Richmond offices filled with evidence photos and clutch photographs of the victims, and the investigative rhythm became relentless. Follow the lead, process the scene, re-interview witnesses, compare tire impressions, look for fiber matches. One of the recurring threads investigators pursued was the impersonation theory. Multiple motorists later reported being signaled by unmarked cars or seeing a vehicle with dashboard lights, only to find out later there was no legitimate record of a traffic stop. If an impersonator, or someone with actual authority, stopped couples at night, that person could separate them from safety with little suspicion. The implication was terrifying, the pretense of protection used as a weapon. Many analysts speculated that the killer either had knowledge of law enforcement procedures or simply exploited the trust people afford to figures of authority in the dark. Behavioral profiling provided another layer of insight. Agents from the FBI's behavioral unit painted a portrait of a perpetrator who was organized and socially adept, someone able to blend in and command compliance. He likely understood how to restrain and control victims without engendering panic, suggesting either training or chilling natural aptitude. The controlled nature of the scenes, the apparent absence of sexual assault in most reports, and the apparent care taken with victims' belongings pointed less to opportunistic robbery and more to calculated removal. But the evidence was maddeningly thin in ways modern investigators find frustrating. The 1980s left many potential traces vulnerable to weather and handling. Fibers faded, biological material degraded, and chain of custody practices were not always preserved in ways that would satisfy 21st century techniques. For years, partial leads stalled at technological barriers, a rope fiber here, a microscopic hair there, none conclusive enough to name a suspect. Families refused to let the cases become mere cold files. They organized, lobbied, and pressed for continuous investigation. Vigils and remembrance events kept public attention alive enough to sustain periodic reopenings. For many of the families, the search for answers became a life's work. They collected news clippings, maintained contact with detectives, and urged agencies to apply emerging forensic tools to the preserved evidence. The movement of time deepened grief, but it also solidified resolve. Memory and memorials were weapons against oblivion. Advances in DNA technology finally offered a new kind of hope. In the 2000s and into the 2010s, evidence from original scenes was resubmitted for modern analysis. Partial genetic profiles were occasionally reported to investigators internally. The advent of genetic genealogy, which had cracked other notorious cold cases, presented a tantalizing possibility. Even degraded DNA, cross-referenced through distant relatives in public databases, could sometimes identify a previously unknown suspect. Families lobbied for the use of that method on the Parkway files. Investigators evaluated preserved material for suitability and legality. They balanced privacy, evidentiary integrity, and the potential reward of a match. Still, results were ambiguous. Some samples produced partial hits, fragments of DNA that suggested the presence of an unknown male, but none led to a court-ready identification in public reporting. Rumors and leaks occasionally swirled, feeding public speculation, but official statements remained cautious. Leads were active, evidence was being tested, and the case remained open. False confessions and opportunistic claims periodically surfaced, requiring investigators to sift fact from fantasy and to protect families from the emotional whiplash of fleeting hope. Alternative theories circulated in the meantime. Some argued for a local perpetrator with intimate knowledge of the Parkway and its overlooks. Others proposed a transient offender who used the highways to move unseen. A school of thought maintained there could have been more than one killer. Individuals whose crimes, separated by geography and method, nonetheless bled into one terrifying regional pattern. Each theory offered partial fits and glaring contradictions. The ambiguity itself became one of the case's most maddening features. Despite the lack of arrest, the Colonial Parkway cases left a policy mark. Investigative agencies studied the coordination gaps that had slowed information flow across jurisdictions in the 1980s. For federal and local partners, the cases underlined the importance of interagency cooperation on crimes occurring on federal land. Procedural reforms and better evidence preservation practices emerged in part from lessons learned. Small, technical improvements born of tragic necessity. On the ground, the Parkway changed in the public imagination. Once a place for quiet drives and historical contemplation, it took on a layer of caution. Locals avoided its pull-offs after dusk. Parents warned teenagers. Visitors who read the plaques and signs at daytime overlooks sometimes glanced at the tree line with a different awareness. Yet the scenic beauty remained: trees, river, sky, a paradox of landscape and loss. For the families, perseverance remained the lodestar. They continued to meet, share records, and support any credible investigative thread. Some engaged journalists. Others formed informal networks to keep the cases in public view. Public interest, even when sporadic, generated tips that investigators re-examined. Every new lead, however small, received attention, a reflection of decades of commitment. If the truth were to emerge, it would not be because the files were forgotten, but because someone refused to stop searching. As forensic possibilities evolved, investigators quietly reviewed the evidence again and again. Each re-examination taught them something new about what could and could not be proven from decades-old material. Sometimes the lessons were about the limits of science. Sometimes they were about the importance of tenacity and of asking the right questions of old data. No matter the advances, one question remained constant. Did a single person carry out all the crimes, or did several individuals act in the same haunting theater of wooded overlooks and quiet riverbanks? The question shapes every investigative route. A single perpetrator implies a consistent hunt, a developing pattern, and perhaps an escalation or evolution of method. Multiple perpetrators implies convergence by geography and victim profile, a far less tidy, far more unsettling possibility. Decades later, the Colonial Parkway's woods continue to whisper the same questions. Investigators still hope for a breakthrough that will tie fragmentary evidence to a name, a vehicle, a pattern that makes sense in the light of day. Families still gather to read names and light candles. Tourists still drive the road by day, sometimes stopping to look across the river, perhaps unaware of the shadowed history the land keeps. The case remains open, the files remain alive, and the victims remain remembered. The search has been long, imperfect, and often cruel in its false promises. But the work continues on the simple premise that time does not erase duty. Someone is owed an answer, and until the answer comes, vigilance does not end. The years turned into decades, but the shadow of the Colonial Parkway never truly lifted from Virginia's Tidewater region. For many who lived through those years, investigators, families, and local residents, the murders were never just a set of cold files gathering dust in some evidence locker. They were a wound that refused to close, reopened every time someone drove that winding road along the York River, or saw the morning mist settle across the water like a ghostly memory. By the early 1990s, the task force dedicated to the Parkway murders had shrunk. Leads had dried up. Agents who once chased the case with sleepless urgency had either retired or been reassigned. The FBI had gathered thousands of pages of notes, suspect interviews, polygraph results, and scene photos. And yet, there was no clear suspect, no match to the mysterious fibers or rope found in Cathy Thomas's car, and no linkable DNA from any of the 4 double homicides. The case, officially, went cold. But for the families, cold never meant forgotten. Billy Thomas, Cathy's brother, would later describe the case as a ghost that never leaves the room. He kept boxes of letters, police reports, and photos from his sister's life, not just to remember her, but to remind himself that someone out there was responsible. He wrote to the FBI repeatedly, pushing for progress. Rebecca Dowski's parents did the same. They became voices of endurance in the years when media attention faded and the public moved on. In 1996, the Colonial Parkway murders briefly returned to the headlines after renewed interest from local journalists. The FBI confirmed that they were still keeping the cases open, though no new evidence had surfaced. Detectives floated theories: a rogue police officer, a serial killer posing as one, or even a Navy-linked suspect familiar with the route and its patrol patterns. Still, each theory eventually collapsed under the same weight: lack of proof. Then came the era of DNA. By the 2000s, advances in forensic technology had begun solving cases long thought unsolvable. Cold case units across the country were reopening files, retesting evidence, and catching killers who had once seemed invisible. Families of the Parkway victims hoped that one day their turn would come. In 2009, hope flickered again when reports surfaced that the FBI had quietly re-examined evidence from the Colonial Parkway cases. Fiber samples, hair strands, and blood traces, All were submitted for modern testing. Investigators from the Norfolk FBI office confirmed that they were coordinating with the Virginia State Police and the families. But as often happens in cold cases, progress was slow, and results were closely guarded. Then, in 2010, something unexpected happened. A private citizen helped bring the case back into national conversation. Writer and journalist Bill Thomas, Cathy's brother, had spent decades advocating for his sister and the other victims. Frustrated by the lack of communication from law enforcement, he created a website and online community dedicated to preserving the memory of all 8 victims. He began working with true crime investigators, podcasters, and families to share verified details and timelines. His transparency and persistence sparked renewed attention. Soon after, new eyes turned toward the Colonial Parkway Murders. True crime television series like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted revisited the case, broadcasting composite sketches and old crime scene photos to a new generation. The FBI tip line began receiving calls again, mostly theories, some hopeful, others outlandish. But among them were fragments of memory, people who recalled unusual vehicles, suspicious strangers, or odd behavior from acquaintances in the late 80s. Every new detail was logged. Every rumor was cross-checked. Still, the deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling the pattern became. Each crime scene showed signs of control and familiarity. The killer, or killers, knew how to subdue couples without violence, how to gain trust quickly, and how to leave behind almost nothing. The lack of sexual assault, theft, or clear motive made traditional profiling nearly impossible. The scenes didn't show rage or panic. They showed calm, method, confidence. In 2018, a series of Freedom of Information Act (FOA) releases revealed internal FBI memos about the case. They showed that agents had once investigated possible links to several suspects, including former law enforcement officers and individuals connected to the Navy installations near the Parkway. None of those leads ever led to charges, but they deepened the chilling idea that the killer might have been someone trusted. Someone who could flash a badge, use the right tone, and make young couples roll down their windows without question. That theory, the fake cop scenario, became one of the most widely accepted possibilities among independent investigators and family advocates. In 2020, renewed public interest came again when forensic genealogy began solving decades-old cold cases across America. Cases once as complex as the Parkway murders were being cracked using DNA matches from distant relatives in consumer databases. For the first time in years, families like the Thomases and Dowskis began to believe they might see justice within their lifetimes. The FBI confirmed that it had reviewed evidence for potential genealogical testing, but as of today, no match has been made public. Meanwhile, the Colonial Parkway itself remains largely unchanged, beautiful, haunting, and heavy with memory. Locals who drive it late at night sometimes say the silence feels too perfect, as though the road itself remembers what happened. Small memorial crosses still appear along the shoulders near the overlooks where each tragedy unfolded. The air there feels different, still, reverent, and mournful. For many in Virginia, the murders aren't just a case. They're part of the landscape now, woven into the collective memory of the community. Over the years, films, documentaries, and podcasts have explored the mystery. Some present new theories, that the killer may have been a highway patrol trainee, or perhaps a military contractor familiar with law enforcement procedure. Others have speculated that 2 or more individuals might have been responsible. Someone began the pattern, and another continued it, inspired by the earlier crimes. The FBI has never ruled out any of those possibilities. Even today, retired agents admit the case still haunts them. Some have kept files long after retirement, unable to fully walk away. One former investigator told a local reporter in 2019, "There are nights I still see that car in the water. I still think, if we had found one fingerprint, one hair, we could have changed everything." It's easy to think of cold cases as static, as stories frozen in time. But for those who live with their weight, the Colonial Parkway murders are alive in every unanswered question. They are alive in the faces of parents who still speak of their children in the present tense. They're alive in the way the mist rolls off the York River every October, carrying the echoes of laughter that once filled those quiet overlooks. And yet, there's something else alive too, something that has outlasted fear and silence, the relentless determination to find the truth. Bill Thomas continues to advocate for all 8 victims, working directly with law enforcement and citizen investigators. He hosts public discussions, keeps digital archives updated, and refuses to let the case be forgotten. These kids deserve better, he often says. They deserve their names to be remembered for who they were, not for how they were taken. And he's right. Cathy and Rebecca, David and Robin, Keith and Sandy, Daniel and Anna Maria. 8 young souls whose lives ended far too soon, yet whose stories continue to move people decades later. Every time a cold case is solved somewhere else in the country, their families watch with renewed hope. Maybe next time it will be them. Maybe the name of their loved one will finally be followed by the words they've waited decades to hear: case closed. But until that day, the Colonial Parkway remains what it has always been, a place of beauty and sorrow intertwined. A reminder that even the most peaceful roads can hold dark secrets, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment, the right evidence, the right truth to finally emerge from the silence. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the search for justice and the untold stories behind each case. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more revealed crime stories, and we'll see you in the next one.